Okay, so this one's the last video that I'm going to make. First of all, there was a question, I think it was in a 2013 exam, about how floods would impact aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Just in relation to this question, I've sort of seen some people making similar mistakes that they're talking about in the examiner's report. It's important that you take a really macro approach to this question. So what I mean by that is you don't talk about particular industry stuff when you talk about how it affects the economy as a whole, with links to like the components of aggregate demand and key terms like productive capacity and willingness to supply and things like that. So the impact on aggregate demand, you can kind of go both ways. You can talk about how it can actually benefit aggregate demand in the sense that they've got that reconstruction effect through increased investment spending, increased government investment or G2 spending to try and rectify some of the issues associated with the, or rebuild some of the things that got destroyed with the natural disasters. In terms of the impacts on aggregate supply, you know, as it says here, the weaker answers just talked about how it affects bananas and focused on things that affect individual markets. What you want to be talking about is how it affects, you know, infrastructure as a whole, and therefore reduces the willingness and ability to supply for companies. So you can talk about how it hurts our productive capacity because it destroys essential infrastructure. This will lead to higher production costs, reduce aggregate supply, and reduce our overall willingness and ability to supply. So make sure you approach that question with a real macro focus as opposed to a micro focus. All right, some other things, you know, common questions in exams and things that I suppose aren't as clear cut, and really, I suppose some higher order type questions here. If you get asked, you know, why is the deficit reduced, or what are some reasons that are causing the deficit to reduce from a cyclical reason? You know, one reason is that the growth's higher than last year. We're growing at 3.3% now. That's leading to less unemployment. Unemployment's fallen from over 6% to 5.7%. That would be the main one I'd be talking about if you got asked for a cyclical factor. Cyclical factor leading to the lower budget deficit is the fact that growth increased above 3%, and that's led to less unemployment, which is now below 6% as well at 5.6%. But if you're looking for other things, you could talk about the lower oil prices. So the lower oil prices are boosting companies' profits because they're paying less for transportation, and that's helping to boost company tax. You can also talk about the lower prices and how they're boosting people's discretionary income and therefore giving them more money to spend in other areas, which is also leading to more company tax and income tax as well. So lower oil prices is another really good one. Other things you could talk about would be the relatively low Australian dollar and how that can help. But I'd probably be going with the first two. The fact that we're growing a bit faster than last year, we've got lower unemployment, and oil prices are a bit lower, which is helping companies' profits. From a structural factor, the multinational tax avoidance tax, which I talked about in the last video, I should say multinational company, not tax, no double tax. You can talk about excise taxes or the lower superannuation tax concessions should also help. I'd probably be talking about the first two if you got asked for deliberate policies. They're also making it harder to receive some forms of welfare. There's been sort of a lot of news recently, stuff in the news about making it harder for people to pay to get paid parental leave and things like that. In terms of things that have made it harder for the government to reduce their deficit, that would be things like the fact that the terms of trade is still relatively low. Therefore, that's reducing their tax base. This is straight out of the plain English economics. Rising health costs, so you could talk about the ageing population still and how that's leading to them having to pay more for or more expenditure, or you could link it to more unemployment. The fact that not more unemployment, but unemployment is still above that 5% target range. There's some other things you can talk about. All right, this section is basically just some other random things to be aware of for your exam. A couple of things. One, when they lower the target cash rate, make sure you're mentioning that the RBA is buying securities. Okay, they're trying to increase the liquidity of the banks, so they're buying securities, and that will shift the supply curve to the right for the banks and lead to lower cash rate. If you're talking about a positive for inflation for businesses, it's mainly negative, and the link to the negative is a lot easier. But one benefit would be for importing businesses, so people that are trying to sell imported products and compete against Australian products. So that might be like people trying to resell TVs like JB Hi-Fi and stuff like that. Benefits of monopolies. We talk a lot about the inefficiencies that monopolies can create, but there are also some benefits, and those benefits generally stem from the fact that monopolies mean that you guarantee the profits. So if you have a monopoly over creating a book, or a monopoly over a song, or a monopoly over creating a drug, it allows you to generate all the profits from that drug. So with pharmaceuticals, you get 7 years to sell your own drug before other people can sort of replicate that product, and that's one way that it's helping to encourage innovation. So monopolies are not all bad. They lead to economies of scale, which can be good, and they also can encourage innovation. In terms of market power, if you get asked how the government can reduce market power, think of things like merger tests, preventing big companies from getting together, preventing collusion and price signalling, so trying to prevent businesses from signalling to each other's prices. So the ACCC with the petrol companies, they can't all decide to raise prices on the weekends. You could also talk about they can't be involved in predatory pricing where they try and get rid of competition as well. So that's another way the government intervenes. In terms of asymmetric information, the main one would be laws against defective products and laws against misleading conduct. So we talked about that $250,000 fine if you deliberately mislead someone or you're deliberately deceptive. There's also warranties to protect yourself against sort of buying sort of dodgy or lemon cars as well. So there would be some ways the government intervene. In terms of the mining boom and relative prices, I'm not going to go through that here, but there's a video on it if you're sort of struggling with how the end of the mining boom has affected relative prices and the allocation of resources. It's a good video that will help you to sort of discuss those issues. Government failures. Government failures, again, it's something we glossed over throughout the year, and I'd be very surprised if it was on your exam. But if you do get asked for types of government failures, the minimum wage is a good one. That's made us a lot less competitive and led to higher production costs for businesses and reduced our international competitiveness. Some other ones would be too much regulation of certain markets. So they used to regulate like Commonwealth, the banking sector and the airline sector and things like that. That led to less competition and reduced efficiency. Other things, the botched home insulation scheme we never really talked about in class, but that was in the news a lot. And the high level of government debt is another form of government failure you could talk about. Another thing that's very unlikely to come up, but influences on economic agents, so some of the external and internal things that affect consumers and businesses and things like that. So if you do have time, it's just a 6-minute video on YouTube that may be worth watching in preparation for any questions on that. So it's kind of talking about things like lobby groups and unions and how unions can fight for better wages for employees, and that can affect businesses because it affects their production costs. Again, sort of change of stance here, but with the current account balance, if you get a question on the graph with the current account, make sure, rather than saying that the current account is increasing or something like that, if you see the graph trending upwards, if the graph's trending upwards, it means a lower current account deficit. So make sure you refer to the size of the current account deficit. Be careful of any graph that has like a right-hand side axis and a left-hand side axis. Make sure you're reading off the right axes. There was one in the practice exam with the TWI and the Australian dollar versus the US dollar. Make sure you're reading the right axes for what you're talking about if there are two axes. But yeah, make sure with the current account, if it is trending sort of that way, hang on, I think I need an actual thing to draw that. If it's sort of trending that way, no, that's not working. That way, then it's a sign that the current account deficit is decreasing. So use that terminology rather than saying there's been an increase or something like that. Other mistakes people are making, don't say an increased participation rate means a weaker labour market. So if you're linking something to immigration, say it leads to a looser labour market. A weak labour market is generally referring to a lack of aggregate demand. So try and not use that term if you're talking about higher participation. Participation will generally increase when we have a stronger labour market because there's less discouraged workers. Said this in the last part that this year's budget still increases public sector debt, so I'm not going to talk about that again. Always links to, if you're talking about aggregate supply things, try and link them to our international competitiveness. So the fact that it will lead to lower prices and therefore boost export demand and lead to increased real GDP. It's a good way to talk about how aggregate supply policies help to boost our long-term economic growth. So if you're talking about immigration, you can say in the long term it helps to boost export spending because of the lower prices. You can also link that with infrastructure spending or any form of supply side policy. If you do get asked for a question that says, what are they doing in this year's budget to get us back to surplus, I suggest you don't use things like the lower company tax or increased training and education. While these things can help to boost revenue in the long term by making us more productive and things like that, they're not going to help inflationary pressures in the short term. So they're not going to help us get back to the surplus in the short term, and they're actually going to lead to more outlays in the short term. So don't use that as your chosen policy for getting the budget back to surplus. Choose something that's actually contractionary and leading to more revenue or less expenditure. Alright, last couple of things. In terms of certain questions about the carbon tax or microeconomic reform policies and immigration, examiners love when you can separate the short and long-term impacts. So, for example, if you're talking about microeconomic reform policies, you might be talking about like how it affects external stability, and you talk about increasing importing in the short term or increased unemployment in the short term if you're talking about full employment. They love short versus long-term impacts for these types of questions, so try and give them what they want. Immigration, can lead to more unemployment because of bigger participation, can lead to it can have negative implications for the labour market in the short term. I said this again in the last video, but with any question about that asks you how will this thing affect the RBA's stance, make sure you refer to the charter and say things like this will help to keep inflation under control, so the RBA might focus more on growth and employment. Really link things back really well to the charter when you're doing those questions. If you're talking about contractionary budgets and how they will affect external stability, you can talk about how they reduce public sector debt, because surpluses will help to reduce the size of public sector debt and therefore should lead to less foreign debt. But you can also talk about how contractionary budgets should help to reduce the level of import spending. So they help the CAD because there's that idea of the twin deficits theory. Bigger deficits lead to bigger CADs because we generally import more. Smaller deficits or surpluses should help reduce the CAD because they're contractionary, people have less money, and it leads to less spending and less spending on imports. And if you're looking for a reason why commodity prices have rebounded a little bit in the last couple of months, it flows through mainly because of a lack of other countries' supplies dried up a little bit, so there's been a slight decrease in world supply of commodities. But the main reason commodity prices the supply of commodities in Australia has increased is because we spend so much money on infrastructure. We have all the facilities now, we don't need to build anymore, that's why investment spending has slowed down, but it's also the reason for such a high volume of commodity exports. The other thing I'll just finish with is that it's really important that you link to why productivity is really important in Australia at the moment. We're not getting the large prices for commodities, so we need to be more competitive in healthcare, in service industries and stuff like that. So it's really important that you can link that. The productivity helps to create demand in those industries and allows us to transition away from the mining boom. That's all. Good luck tomorrow. Thank you.